Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining the latest Service Department News webinar today in partnership with PriceLabs. And we are going to be talking about a very timely and of-the-moment subject, revenue strategies for service departments in a hybrid hospitality world. My name's Eloise Hanson. I'm the editor of Service Department News, and we are an online trade publication. We cover the global service department, apart hotel, and extended stay industry. As I mentioned, today's webinar is in partnership with PriceLabs, a revenue management and dynamic pricing platform, and we have a short video to play for you today. And more details about PriceLabs has been popped into the chat if you would like to learn more, and we'll shortly hear from Fausto, who's joining us from the team. So a quick overview of how today's webinar is going to play out. We'll spend around 45 minutes in conversation today with our panelists, followed by some time at the end to take any questions from the audience. So if you do have a pressing question to ask, please submit using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. I'll either save those questions for the end of the conversation, or if it's appropriate and where relevant, I will feed that into our conversation. And as a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded. Everyone that has registered will receive a copy of that recording within 48 hours. So let's meet our panelists for today. It will be easier for me to move from left to right as per the PowerPoint slides. So let's kick off with Fausto. Over to you and welcome.
Well, good. Thank you. Hello, everyone. So my name is Fausto. I'm in charge of our European team. I work at PriceLabs for 5 years now, but I was a PriceLabs user before, so I've been using PriceLabs for a long, long time. Yeah, and happy to, if anyone has any extra question or anything about it, you can find me in LinkedIn and send me a message.
Super. Thank you, Fausto. Vincent, over to you and welcome.
Hi everyone, I'm Vincent. I'm acting head of commercial and revenue at Lamington. Lamington is specialized for long stay with their Lamington Service Apartment brand, and Room 2, which is a hotel product, so mix between hotel and Airbnb.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vincent. Mark, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark Winship. I'm the co-founder and director of Gateway Accommodation. We're a UK-based hospitality business. We operate a mixed portfolio ranging from apart hotels and service departments to holiday lets. And we are right from pretty much the Arctic Circle in the Shetland Islands right down to the southern tip of the UK, so top to bottom. We've been operating since 2018. So we've just about navigated COVID and all the challenges that threw at us through that period as well. And I'm also, with my wife, I'm the host of the Secret Service podcast, where we dish the dirt on the inner workings of our hospitality business, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
That would explain the impressive setup that you have. I'm looking at the mic thinking, yeah.
It's just one corner of the room. I can't move my screen an inch either side.
Thank you, Mark. And Josh, over to you.
All right, everybody. My name is Josh Lowe. I'm the Chief Customer Officer at HostAway. HostAway is the largest property management software for vacation rentals. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Josh. And last but by no means least, Augustin.
Hi, everyone. So, yes, I'm Augustin. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for Bob W. We're a service department brand, and we try to be available from one night to several months, which is one of the big challenges that I'm sure we'll discuss today. And yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Brilliant, thank you. And as I mentioned, all the LinkedIn profiles of our speakers have been popped into the chat. We've got lots to get through today, so I would encourage you to connect and carry on that conversation after today's webinar. So before we dive in, let's provide some context. So we recently featured Sue Kim Bae from Capitaland Investments and the Ascot Limited on our podcast show. In which she talked about the convergence of hotels, service departments, and co-living. And it's a great example of how large companies are adopting what Ascot calls a flex hybrid portfolio, with the ability to pivot across those guest segments and different lengths of stay. Sojourn, which is a furnished apartment and corporate housing operator based in Washington, D.C., has also acquired a vacation rental company called Salt Coast Hosts. So this portfolio diversification is also happening among the smaller players too. But what's happening at property level? Well, we've recently seen that Adagio has just opened its first apart hotel with co-living suites in the UK. It had previously only been available in France, in Paris, I believe. And on the next slide, sticking with what's happening at property level, we're seeing other models, operational models come through. So this includes leasing inventory from multifamily or build-to-rent projects on a shorter term let, as is the case with Placemakers, pop-up apart hotel within a multifamily property in Reno, Nevada. And I've also seen a handful of cases where residential players, so your long stay operators, are looking to flex down into the long and mid-stay market, as we've seen with Livink, which is part of the Park Lane Group. Some of you may know as the parent company of the Rooms apart hotel brand. Livink has recently launched a platform that enables users to book properties from 1 night to 1 year. So this is giving landlords access that maybe don't typically advertise for long stays, capturing a shorter to mid-stay market. So I hope that provides some context as to why we're here and what's been happening within the sector or within the market more broadly. I want to kick off with a question to Fausto, if I may, because I would imagine that these operators or brands, the reason why diversification or these flexible models are coming to the fore is because guest behavior is changing, and as are booking behaviors. So what are you seeing, Fausto, in terms of those booking windows and the average length of stay shifting more generally?
Yeah, so and it is important that my comment is about general information. It's not specific markets, so different markets behave different. But in general, we have been seeing that the booking window is getting shorter, and the length of stay is increasing a little bit. Of course, this depends on the country, depends if it's a seasonal market or an urban market, etc. But the booking window is decreasing almost in all markets. But in general, all markets are getting like bookings coming in shorter to the check-in date. And this happened a little bit after COVID. There was a kind of mixed behavior where some locations were behaving in a certain way, others weren't. Now, in my personal opinion, I think it's getting to the normal. It's getting back to normal, like before COVID. So I think operators should prepare that low seasons will be low seasons, high seasons will be high seasons. That kind of having a lot of demand in a low season, I think it will become less and less common. What interesting enough, it's what we have seen is that rural accommodation, like it's behaving a little bit different. So in that case, in some markets, not urban, like rural, and not beach markets, like rural markets, the booking window is not decreasing as much. So it's keeping the same kind of behavior. But the rest, usually, it's booking windows getting shorter, average length of stay getting a little bit longer.
What trends do you think is driving that? You referenced that coming out of COVID, these behaviors are changing. Are we looking at hybrid work? Are we looking at what is traditionally a corporate market now tapping more into leisure travelers? What personal opinion, what do you think is driving this change?
I think it's a mix of after COVID, everyone, after being closed at home, everyone wanted to travel. So there was a boom. Then it became a little bit to the normal behavior. But I will say that this mix of business and corporate with leisure, it is increasing. Right? I heard some people talking about leisure or something like that. So I think it's becoming a little bit more of a trend. Of course, certain destinations, you don't see it as much. Like if you look at London, maybe it's not the best city where you see this happening. But in other cities, for example, other even European capitals, you can see a lot more, like the average length of stay is increasing. In terms of the booking window, I just think that there's a lot of supply. So the supply, the growth was so big that people, they know that they will have an accommodation unless there is a specific event that they see, okay, probably I will not get somewhere to stay. There's so much supply in some markets that people tend to wait a little bit more to see if they get a better deal.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Fausto. I want to turn to the operators now and the brands just to check in to see whether these trends or how these trends are actually playing out within the properties and the portfolios themselves. So let's kick off with Mark. Has what Fausto explained tally with what you're seeing?
Yeah, 100%. I would definitely agree that we're seeing a general trend towards a shorter booking window in particular, especially through bookings that come through the channels, through the online travel agents. We're definitely seeing that kind of behavior across the board. That being said, I think it's increasingly hyper local. It's very, very dependent on the guest profile that you're working with for that particular property, the location, the property type itself. So whereas before we were able to sort of operate with fairly broad suite data, now we're really having to kind of knuckle down into the hyper local, almost property by property. And we've done a lot of work on identifying segments within different markets. You know, it's not just leisure and corporate or leisure and working stays anymore. It's actually really getting into what are the niches and the segments within that, and what are their needs, requirements, buying habits, buying psychology, that sort of thing, because we are noticing very different. And I do think, again, supply and demand does play a massive factor, where we're operating properties up in the Shetland Islands, for example, which might be one of the few places left in the UK where supply and demand is still in our favour. We're taking bookings into 2027 already, which is pretty exceptional. But then equally, we've got properties in busy cities in the UK, particularly multi-unit and apart hotel properties, where, you know, we might be looking at a 7-day, 10-day, even less sometimes booking window where people are just waiting to see who's dropping rates at the last minute so that they can get the best possible deal. So I think what we've particularly been focusing on over the last few months is tracking forward-looking measures as well as looking back. So whereas previously we would have looked at occupancy, how we're doing, can we afford to put the prices up a little bit? Do we need to drop the prices? Now we're looking very much at things like pacing, and trying to understand what the what sort of characterizes the individual segments that we're operating in.
It sounds like the role of the revenue manager. I mean, I've covered this within the hotel sector, how that's shifting and how it's becoming more complex, perhaps. And we certainly see this by what you're saying, we certainly see this playing out within the extended stay market as well. Fausto, your hand is up.
To add one thing, I think it's becoming different. So I think the skills for a good revenue manager today is different from the skills to a good revenue manager in 10 or 15 years ago. 15 years ago, it was analytical, Excel kind of wizard, all of this. Now you don't need it anymore. Like the tools, AI, everything, they work all the data, right? So you have to be a little bit more having kind of a macro vision, understanding the tourism industry as a whole, in understanding different cultures, different behaviors, and be very good with people, because you have to be able to communicate and spread a little bit of this philosophy throughout the team. That is sometimes not very easy.
Mm-hmm. Augustine, I'm keen to hear your thoughts, because I'm aware that Bob W has a broader geographic footprint, and I'm just curious to hear whether or what you're seeing across average length of stays, booking patterns, changing customer behaviors and preferences. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, so I think there is definitely what I would call a red ocean if you look at short lead times. So what we're seeing is there is, yes, there are shorter lead times and slightly longer length of stays, but at the same time, you don't necessarily want to be fighting against everybody else in these short booking windows. And we've done a lot of work in trying to understand when we should be selling our inventory and when that's most profitable. And the conclusion for now is that it's extremely dependent on the type of units that you're selling. So we have some of our properties that are mostly studios and they have kitchenettes and they're suitable for long stays, but they mostly behave like hotels, in my opinion. Some of the markets price low to high, or it's rather static, but it's something that I've seen in my hotel days. As soon as you shift to apartments, for us, it's really like between 2 and 3 months out that we think we can make the most revenue, and also we can achieve the better profits because, I mean, it's not rocket science, but if you're going to rent a 3-bedroom apartment, it's unlikely that you're going to do it for next week. And even though that's a very simple, fact, it's not necessarily easy to differentiate your pricing strategy depending on the units that you're selling.
Mm-hmm. Vincent, I'd like to bring you in here because I think we talked about this briefly, about how do you tailor the right product to sell at the right time. But I want to tie this in with KPIs and how is the metrics that you're tracking shifting as a result?
There is a first shift between traditional revenue management, which is where I started my career, and then moving more towards a long stay product, or in my case, a hybrid product where I still have some short stay mixed with long stay, a bit like Augustin was mentioning. And there is definitely some learning curve, and you need to adapt quickly to the change. So in terms of KPI, your same time last year should not be read and interpreted the same way as in an hotel, because if you had we work not just with a long stay, but with group long stay. So we have a fair amount of our inventory that might be sold for 3 months or 6 months in some cases. Obviously, they are ad hoc. So when they are not coming back next year, your same time last year might be meaningless to just take it blank like that. You need to put context into it, and therefore adjust sometimes the conversation around it, the gap to be closed, and so on. The average length of stay is something you barely talk about in traditional revenue management, and in hotel, that's our bread and butter. Literally, it become one of our most important KPI, and something that with my colleague in Lamington, we try to develop this culture as well. So lots of people coming from hotels, and me including. At first, I had to get used to that and say, okay, average length of stay. Now we don't make our life easier in our industry in a way that we can calculate this KPI in different way. So depending on the system, depending on who you talk to, we don't always exactly calculate it the same way, but that's for a different debate, I guess. And the other one is displacement as well. I know I mentioned to you before, but displacement is interesting. So as I say, we will take groups, long stay groups, and typically displacement, you will displace days. What happened on my long weekend, if I displace my Saturdays, things like that. When it comes to long stay, we displace season. So I had a good example last year. A group wanted to arrive in our high season, but live in our low season. And the conversation, the calculation behind it became much more interesting exercise, I would say. And we had to do it mostly manually, because there is not an easy tool in our tech, in our company, to do that for such a kind of request. So that was interesting, and that's created a new approach. So you need to really think differently. Plus, Augusta mentioned it, and that's the most important, I think, eventually, it's a cost. Because we're not really revenue manager, we're more profit strategist. And the cost of operating a long stay versus a short stay, you make so much saving in a cleaning of the bedding, the towel, all the linen, the staff as well. So you can afford to take a much lower rate. Plus, every Sundays are pretty much incremental stay. So when you got a stay of several weeks, the rate might seems a bit low, but if you realize that it's a beautiful even pickup and you don't have any shoulder dates issue, you make a lot of saving on the cost. All that need to be really taken into consideration. So the long stay are definitely one of the most profitable segment in our industry. But they do create some time gaps. So then we complement them. And in some cases, not just complement, it can be part of our hotel strategy as well to fill up with still short stay. Short stay in our case are still quite important as well on my room to products.
I'll come back to you and Augustine later just to talk about really trying to slice and dice that inventory and how do you tailor and how do you fill in the short-term gaps with a longer stay type of guest. But I'd like to bring Josh into the conversation now because I think Mark mentioned he briefly touched on distribution, and I think Mark, you mentioned an increase in OTAs, so worthwhile bringing in the distribution angle of how do we actually sell and when are we selling. So Josh, what are you seeing from your customers in terms of how they are adapting their distribution or pricing strategies to actually align with these changing booking behaviors and lead times and booking windows?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yeah, we're seeing a lot of our clients that are dealing with those types of situations moving beyond Airbnb. The most popular one is direct, right? And you make more money direct, and you're able to really control revenue streams. You're able to control minimum nights of stays. You have a lot more flexibility when using a direct versus OTAs. But, there are people that are always looking for different channels to be on. Typically what we see is your big three that just Airbnb, your Vrbo, your Booking.com is still kind of where you want to be. But being able to be flexible with your direct and driving more traffic there for your mid to long term stays, because we do see a lot of people that go and book these mid to long term stays that we'll find on Airbnb, and maybe you won't even have any kind of discounts or any sort of flexibility when it comes to mid or long term. They'll go find your website and go there. And if you don't have a website set up for direct booking, you're going to lose out, right? Because people are looking for that, especially people looking for mid and long-term stays. They typically do this fairly often, so they know kind of what to go look for on the internet versus someone that's booking an Airbnb from time to time. So really, I would say key is getting your direct booking website up for more flexibility. Using dynamic minimum night rules to capture longer stays, like that's key in these situations too, to make sure that you're not leaving any gaps.
Can I follow up with advice, because I know you've just mentioned here that it's worthwhile getting your direct booking engine on your website set up and ready to go. But if there was a takeaway that anyone listening to this webinar right now could walk away and implement or start pinning down a strategy to boost that revenue from direct bookings, what would you advise, Josh?
I would say you start it is the number one thing. And I say second, get on Google Vacation Rentals. And you're not going to see a lot from Google Vacation Rentals right away. But if there's any horse I'm going to bet on, it's going to be Google. And so if you get in there now and you start playing around and you start getting on Google Vacation Rentals, when you start seeing the change in user behavior, if you think about Google Flights, right? I always bring this up. It's like, I remember I used to, just up until probably 5 years ago, I'd log into United or Turkish Air and I'd go find my flights there, right? And even though you could go on Google and type in the airlines there, now I don't use it at all because I just go to Google and I type San Antonio to London or whatever, right? And I find it there. This same behavior is going to end up happening with short-term rentals. And so if you're going and adopting it sooner rather than later, you're gonna be at an advantage out of others that are going to be laggers in technology. And so Google Vacation Rentals interacts directly with your direct booking website too. So that's why it kind of intertwines. Is like that would be your number one way to go in and start promoting it. The other ones are, social media, direct marketing. There's things like, Wi-Fi routers you can get that actually captures your guest information to remarket to them. So there's a lot of different strategies, but I'd say number one that I do first thing is get your website up. It's not a hard thing to do anymore. You just go find a provider to do that. Most PMS providers do that. Hostaway does that free of charge for you. And you can spin one up right away. And then Google Vacation Rentals would be that second low barrier to entry where you just click a button and now you're in Google and you kind of set it and forget it.
Thanks, Josh. Mark, I'd like to come back to you because your portfolio is quite broad in terms of your customer segment and the products that you offer. So how are you aligning your distribution strategy with making sure that you are optimizing the right product for the right person and also balancing or being able to balance those shorter stays in and amongst the longer term?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sort of the mainstay of our sort of strategy moving forwards is largely in the sort of multi-unit and apart hotel strategy. And I think that's where we face potential challenges on that front. One of the unique challenges that we face with that actually is making sure that our inventory is not competing with itself. Because I go back to what I said at the start about things getting more and more hyper local. Now, if you launch an apart hotel with 25 units, for example, then you're potentially adding 15, 20, 25% to the stock in your hyper local sort of market straight away. So it's making sure that you understand that and you manage your inventory strategically, which is all about, I think, just for us, it's about, again, understanding buying psychology. It's a combination of buying psychology and data and bringing those two things together, I think. So we look very much at our far out pricing strategy because although we've talked about trends towards shorter booking windows, you can still influence that behavior with setting your pricing and your revenue management in the right way. So we look at our far out pricing strategy, but combining that with stay restrictions and things like orphan gap settings to make sure that we're filling any sort of awkward gaps that are created by those longer stays that are booked a long time in advance. We're PriceLabs users, so things like occupancy-based adjustments are really important for us because where we've got apart hotels, what tends to happen is on certain platforms, booking.com, it's a lot easier. They're built really with hotels as their background. The whole platform is structured more towards hotels. Airbnb starting to get into that space, but is still not enough of a compelling reason to do anything other than list a lot of the units individually on Airbnb. And the problem with that is, a couple of them get booked. The algorithm picks that up. It makes them more visible. They get booked a bit more at the expense of your other rooms. And you can find that actually you get quite an unoptimized situation within the property. So things like occupancy-based adjustments allow us to look at the occupancy across that whole building, if you like, and make sure that we're not out competing each other. So it really does, again, I think it comes back to that sort of hyper local understanding of the buying psychology within your market segment and combining that with the data as well.
Vincent, let's pick up here and let's build on this buying psychology. You mentioned about group sales or group trips or group buyers, group travelers. What have you learned about guest segments? And that could be groups, it could be digital nomads, it could be your leisure, that actually helps you tailor your inventory. So building on everything that Mark's just mentioned, and perhaps more importantly, how and when do you start prioritizing your short versus longer stays and vice versa?
A lot of good questions here. I will start actually with the last one, which is the easiest one. You will typically always prioritize a long stay, always. So the average rate may seem lower usually. They are more beneficial and they have a bigger impact on your bottom line P&L. The only time you really go short stays when there is a proper event. In Belfast, for example, this year there is the Open, big event for the golf in the Gulf. We did optimize there, but we still keeping some inventory for the long stay because we don't want to say no to somebody who is there very long. When it comes to segmentation, it's almost more distribution here. The key when it comes to that, what we've learned, and we've done that, we adapt. So we try different things and we learn. The same product can be sold under different name. So we got different room type. The top one will be our suite, but the suite will have a room separate in some of our hotels or an open space room, these kind of things. Suite is great for hotels, but in a world of the agency long stay, in UK we call that SABA. That's our industry for the agency long stay. They will be more keen to book a one bedroom that resonates more with them than suite. So the same product might have slightly different naming depending on where we want to push them, so they resonate better with a final user. So that would be one learning curve here. Adapts, and the same with the picture. Some photo are more relevant than other. When you want to stay long stay, you really want washing machine and dryer, for example. So that's more predominant. So on some portal, which are more for the long stay distribution, we will put that, make sure that we've got that as an evidence and in our description as well to make it clear. When maybe if we target purely leisure, family that come for the weekend in Belfast, they don't really care about that, but they will be more interested in the family activity and the fact that there is a Titanic museum not so far and all these kind of things. So that's where as well you need to adapt in your description. So the distribution is quite key, I think, in our industry, and sometimes I would say might be overlooked in general. So again, that's one of the learning curve that's changed from traditional to more long stay product.
Thank you. And Augustine, do you also prioritize the long over the short, and how are you making sure that you are tailoring your inventories to the right person?
Well, we do. I think maybe not quite as much. I think the answer depends heavily on your cost structure. So for us, we clean our rooms and apartments after the 6th night. So technically for us, a 7-night stay is less profitable than a 6-night stay. We've done a lot of calculations, and we think that the best profit for us is 3 and 4-night stays. And that's when we take into account the discounts that has to be given for a longer stay and of course the reduced cost. So I think it really depends on if you're just giving the apartment almost like a long-term, rental, then you really virtually you have no cost once a person is in. So then it would be quite different. And then as for sort of segmenting customers, I think that's for us it's more of an exercise of almost like branding and performance marketing, as in who we want to speak to. From a revenue management standpoint, it's more about, I would agree with the channel approach of Vincent, which is you need to understand where were you looking for is booked. And so, for example, there is a lot of long lead bookings that are made on booking.com, right? And so it doesn't mean that it's the primary channel for this, but long lead, long stays, but it exists, and you can see if you're getting your fair market share or not. If you're not getting it, then there's probably a problem. And equally, Airbnb was discussed before. I think a few months ago, we noticed that our average length of stay on Airbnb was barely higher than Expedia or Booking.com. It was 0.1 higher. It was ridiculous. It was nothing. And then we did we did a bit of a test work with AirDNA, which is a data company specializing on Airbnb, and it was just initial workshops that we had with them, nothing more serious. But what we could see for one of the markets we picked is that there is a lot of long lead, long stays demand from Airbnb. We're just not getting it because we were pricing too much like a hotel. So we were not getting the business because we're 15% too expensive. And then we're getting the last minute weekends or the hand-dos or this type of things, which is not that's never a week long, is it? Which probably is safer. So yeah, that's I think it's more around like understanding where people book and do they match what you're looking for.
Yeah, so advice here, maybe an internal audit on across your channels and target segments and yeah, maybe understanding your target guest a bit better.
Indeed.
Fausto, let's bring you in here, and let's actually talk about some the strategies that operators can start building in when it comes to Augustine's point, pricing correctly and adjusting your rates, especially when you are trying to balance the short versus the longer stays. What would you advise here?
I will. It doesn't matter if it's short stay, long stay. Sometimes people jump to the price. I agree what Mark mentioned. I think everyone mentioned segmentation is the first step. Okay, so this depends in your market, depends the type of product that you are selling, and depends on your goals, right? And then depends on regulations, local regulations, if you can do it or not, if you can do a mix of both or not, etc., etc., etc. In some cities you could. You For example, Madrid, it was a very good market to do a mix. Now you can't do a mix. You have to only do long term or short term, etc. So it starts to get a little bit more complicated. My suggestion is always to, if I have the freedom to do the strategy that I want, I personally think that the best option is to work with three things. The first is I will not focus on the price first. I will focus if I can have a good strategy of dynamic minimum stays to do a mix of both. I need to know exactly in at the moment on which booking window I want to focus in one thing or the other, and at what moment the risk of losing a long term is important. So I should open to a short term, for example, because selling long term, and of course it's different. If you work with corporate and fully corporate, you have a lot of contracts already. You have banks, you have whatever. So there's already like a flow of contracts coming in. But if you are selling long term in OTAs, or like, the risk becomes high. So if I don't have a booking the next 20 days, it's very complicated, right? So having a mix of a good dynamic minimum stays, like changing the minimum stay depending on my strategy. Also understanding very well the booking windows in my market for both the long terms and then the short terms. And I think that you should work with length of stay pricing. So I don't, me personally, I prefer to have everything open and then apply discounts by length of stay. I'm not saying that you should apply like 3 nights, one discount, 4 nights, another discount. It's not that, but you decide like, okay, I want to give a discount if someone is staying 1 week, and then I want to give another discount if someone is staying 2 weeks or 1 month or 2 months, whatever. But working with this length of stay, but keeping the calendars open. And I think this is useful for someone that moves between both worlds, right? I want some long terms, but I also want some short term. If I only want, like Vincent was saying, we prefer long term. In our markets, our product, we want long terms. Maybe the strategy is different. But for someone that wants a mix of both, I will be sure that I can do dynamic minimum stays and length of stay pricing.
Mm-hmm. I want to stick with the technological element here of our conversation, because I've spoken to a number of tech companies, and I think the difficulty is when it comes to trying to apply discounts to different lengths of stay. Perhaps the legacy systems are having to innovate at a quicker pace in order to add the technology in order to meet the needs of its clients or customers. And when you have operators that are perhaps on legacy systems and are now wanting to flex, how does one start to integrate and incorporate all the tech? So Fausto, if you're welcome to come in here, but I'll bring Josh in too, about the innovations and the integrations that we are now seeing come to the fore that is allowing operators to streamline this flexible operational model. Josh, let's kick off with yourself first.
Sure, yeah. So one of the things that, we kind of didn't hit on here is, when we say that property managers are wanting to do mid-stays, mid-term and longer term stays, a lot of these guys and gals, they're being forced into it, right? So when you look at regulations that are coming around, you look at Portugal, for example, that's going back and forth about mid-stays and short-term and reducing licenses. A lot of places here in the United States, not a lot of places, cities and counties and governments here, each have their own different rules. So you're actually ending up with like property management companies out there that have 1/3 of their portfolio on midterm because of some regulations, and the rest of it on short term. And then you have some longer term. And so, to your point, like it's incredibly important, especially with all these that are coming up, to have software technology that is able to do both, because you need it, right? And so for us here at Hostaway, what's been key is we unified inboxes, right? So that you can make sure that you're taking care of your midterm stay, guest management, as well as your short-term rentals, keeping that business, because you don't want to manage your short-term rentals, your midterm rentals in a different platform. There's there's no advantage at that point, right, to having two different systems. It just causes confusion. Having an open API, like we have an open API that we can, and we partner with a lot of people with like PriceLabs to bring in, integrations to help with, different aspects of either the cleaning or for short-term or midterm, your pricing with PriceLabs or Breezeway with the cleaning. But really the key for us here is making sure we're listening to what's going on in the industry, like short-term, midterm, and really developing the software around that, and not just getting too stuck in like, how are things right now? How are things pre-COVID? How are things post-COVID? And then let's just keep going the way it is, because it is going to be ever changing. We still are dealing with a fairly young industry, right? Vacation rentals have been along forever. Don't get me wrong there, but we still are dealing with kind of a emerging market here.
Mm-hmm. Fausto, is there anything you would like to add here from a tech standpoint around the innovations and integrations that are allowing customers or your customers to effectively cater to these flexible length of stays?
I think sometimes operators need to decide what is priority for them in terms of tech stack, right? Sometimes we think the opposite, like we have the operation and now let's think about what tool are we going to use that will adapt to my operation. But in reality, this is a little bit more difficult to do than the rest. That is, let's rethink my operation, and we put the technology in the middle, and now we say, okay, if I have this tech stack, I can operate better, right? So and with AI now, it should be the core and think about it. But to be very practical to the real world, let's say like that, I will say that operators should decide what is a priority and make the right questions. Like if I go and talk with Hostaway, for example, I need to tell them exactly, I need this for my operation to work, and they will tell me we can do exactly this, or we cannot do this at the moment, but we can develop. And that's the second part. When it's related to technology, I think that's two things that is very important. It's the product team and the support team. You need to understand if the product team of that PMS in this case, but can be an RMS, whatever, has the bandwidth and the team to be able to develop something in a normal time. Everything takes time, but in a normal time. The issue starts when you say, okay, I will work on it. I will develop a new feature. I will update and have an upgrade because the market changed. And then it takes 2 years, because when this goes live, you already have 5 on the pipeline that are delayed. So I think it's understand what you need, what is priority, and when you decide your tech stack, be sure that this is available. As I mentioned, if you want to do long term and you want to be in OTAs, etc., you have to be sure that you can work very well on minimum stays, that you don't want to be open and closing calendars manually. You have to be sure that you have the data to be able to decide. For example, if you use an RMS and you want to use both, the RMS has to have the ability to create comp sets for long stay and for short stay. If you don't have that ability, how will you use data for long stay, for example? So I think that's the main thing. It's more like be sure that you know the right questions when you decide something.
Thanks, Fausto. I want to pick up on your point about data. And I think it was Mark who mentioned that around forecasting and looking forward and backwards and combining those data sets. How are you using those advanced analytics to actually look at what's coming up in terms of those revenue opportunities within that multi-length stay model?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as operators who have been in the trenches for a few years, you start to get a good feel, sort of anecdotal feel for your market, for your customers, what they're looking for. You've spoken to enough of them, you've had enough of them state your property and leave you feedback. But I think increasingly, particularly as you scale, and particularly as we move into what we're increasingly finding is quite a reactive market, I think, to world events and a lot of the sort of economic factors that are affecting people. It's ever more important to combine that with a data-driven approach, and I think that just gives you the confidence that you are aligning. So we combine the work that I mentioned around really understanding the buying psychology, the buying habits of our individual segments, with things like competitor benchmarking. So really looking at what similar operators who are operating in a similar market segment in our area, what are they doing? What can we infer about their strategy? How are they performing? And how do we both make sure that we are fitting in with that? And I think somebody mentioned earlier about realizing that they weren't optimized for longer stays on Airbnb because the price was just a little bit too high and it just pushes you out of that window. So are we fitting in with that? But also, can we identify areas where there are opportunities there, where our competitors potentially haven't spotted a particular niche or a particular trend that we can capitalize on, and we can modify things like length of stay, restrictions, pricing, whatever it is, to capitalize on that. So it's combining all of those things, I think, but data really gives you the confidence to move forwards. And I think that's what we found. And the data tools that are available to us now, even compared to just 4 or 5 years ago, really enable you to sort of take that holistic view, if you like, and be more proactive rather than reactive. And that's where the forecasting, looking ahead, occupancy mapping, so that you can spot gaps and you can tweak things accordingly.
I'd like to pick you up quickly on the benchmarking aspect, because we're seeing, I mean, my context slides showed how there's blurring lines now, either at property level or maybe portfolio level, around the long stay, the mid stay, and the short stay. And I think we actually joked around, Mark, how do we now categorize what we deliver? Are we a service department operator? Are we a short-term rental operator? When it comes to your benchmarking, how are you assessing who to benchmark against if everything's now blurring?
This is where we talk about advanced data analytics. This is where that really comes into the fore. The days of going on to Airbnb and having a look at some of the other properties in your area and looking at their calendars and seeing how booked they are. It's just with people operating in so many different ways. Are you looking at an owner-run lifestyle business? Are you looking at somebody that has booked out several weeks in the winter season because they don't want to go over the VAT threshold? Everybody's got their different operating models. So being able to access data where you can create your own comp sets, if you like, you can really knuckle down into who do you want to align with, who are your direct competitors, who are moving in the same segments that you want to move to. That's where that advanced data really comes into its own.
Thanks, Mark. I'd like to bring Augustine back into the conversation here, and I think it's still touching on the data aspects, and I think it was Josh who highlighted that, at least in the States, when it comes to those legalities of different states, and each one having their own rules and regulations. Augustine, across Europe, and obviously different cities are all clamping down in one way or another around the short-term rental elements. How are these legal thresholds influencing your operational and your pricing strategies? And perhaps how are you now utilizing the data that's available to optimize accordingly?
Sure. So I think we're lucky, I guess, that we don't have too many buildings that have restrictions on length of stay. We are finding it like everybody else. We're finding it much harder to get new deals, new properties in some cities, and Barcelona is a prime example for sure. But far from the only one. I would say that for us, the UK is probably the only country where we have what's called say-free licenses for a small minority of our buildings. In this case, it becomes an extremely simple question because unless you want to be on the wrong side of the law, you just have 3 months per year to do what you want. And the rest is going to be a lot of the SAVAs, basically the extended stay agencies, the relocation agencies that Vincent was mentioning. And they are an extremely good partner. It just comes with a discount and a cost. So you have to, when you have a choice, you have to weigh that against shorter stays. But in that case, it's a non-problem because it's solved itself through rules and regulations. So from that perspective, it's not too complicated. On the data side, I think we're completely agree with what Mark said, and and Vincent too, we're last year is less and less useful as a point of data, where we're looking a lot at forward-looking data too. So that's STR4s, Demand 360, things like that. And we're not overly concerned that the service department or short-term rental sector is not as well represented as hotels for this, because it still gives us a really good indication. So because what we're trying to decide on is our level of risk, right? So that's, we always forget about risk, but that's the main thing we're doing is deciding how optimistic we want to be about September, for example, which is the same thing as, the more optimistic you are, the more risk you're introducing. And so for that perspective, if our objective is to sell a lot of inventory last minute because we think, we're going to have 10 Lady Gaga concerts and 10 Adele concerts in the same month, which then would be amazing. For us, it's really reassuring to know what the hotel market is doing. Because if we're doing that the market is 20% behind last year, and the business they have is mostly corporate and isn't driven by events so much or by leisure events, then we might want to rethink a little bit our expectations, because like risk is a probability times the consequence, right? So you have to be ready for the consequence too. So yeah, that's how I would define it.
Thank you. And Vincent, is there anything that you would like to add here around, the leveraging data, optimizing data, making sure that you are, operating within the, confines of the law, and making sure that nothing's things
Yes. Well, in the UK, when it comes to pricing, I don't think it was mentioned, but obviously the VAT change after 28 consecutive days. So it's quite specific to this market. So I appreciate that for the IT solution, developing some product that will be specific to each market policy, they say by government, is a bit tricky. But even for us, a rate that has to be distributed, or not a rate because we're different rate, but a product that need to be sold on a VAT 20% that switch suddenly without, just because a politician decided to after 28 days to 4%, it's sometimes a bit a challenge. And obviously the final consumer does not appreciate that, does not understand this most of the time. When it comes to data, I like to use data mainly to identify exceptions. So I love to not look at data that show me that everything goes according to plan. When everything goes according to plan, happy days, you don't need to read too much. It's really when either you've got a specific strategy, and you are deviating from that. So which corrective action do you need to take, or which extra opportunity do you have to extract a bit more money from a specific demand on any given date? So the data we use the same as a hotel, because we hotels as well, at least on one of my brands. And the market share, we do use a traditional market share as well. So same as exactly Augustin was saying, the forward STR, the past STR, all the agency 360 and all this good stuff. Yeah, usually they're more an indication of direction and supporting already a strong strategy, but they do not do a miracle on their own. You still have to have a proper brain and a strategy. I think is the word maybe we didn't use enough today. It's if you don't have a plan, then the outcome is pretty much uncertain de facto. So the best way to focus is really have a plan, execute your plan, and correct quickly when things go out of plan. Either way, if you got extra pickup or under pickup, for example, you need to react and understand why. All market share, if for whatever reason you completely outperform or underperform.
Thank
I don't know
you.
if that answered your question, but
No,
I mean,
it's great.
forecast, the worst to forecast, I would say at the moment, is the actual length of stay. It's very difficult to forecast a length of stay. We're pretty good at forecasting by segment. I know my consumption I pick up from my, OTA, wholesaler, corporate, and so on, long stay groups. But the average length of stay sometimes is surprising because OTA nowadays can, activate as well some long stay requests every now and then, middle of, they send plenty of reservation, and then suddenly, poof, you got quite a few long stay that you didn't expect. So the long stay is, the average rate is what is most difficult to forecast, I would say.
Thank you. I'd like to give the final closing words to Josh first and then end on Fausto, because I think it would be worthwhile to look ahead to the future and maybe look at what trends are going to shape revenue strategies and again, how operators can actually start preparing for these changes. I can see that we've got 2 minutes on the clock, so this is going to be some short and sharp advice. So Josh, let's kick off with you.
All right. I just so happen to have a list, right? So couple of trends that kind of noticed here and that I feel are going to be important are mid-stay monetization, right? So building pricing and operations around 7 and 30-day bookings plus bookings, right? Channel diversification. We mentioned, obviously Airbnb, but getting onto booking.com if you're not on booking.com, and also your direct, right, is very important. AI-led forecasting, so tools that go beyond rate management and help predict who will book and why, right? So your revenue management softwares, your PriceLabs wheelhouses that come into play are extremely important. Investing in flexible tech stacks with solid API access. Talked about that a little bit, but making sure the company you go with for your property management software that really is your nucleus for your business has a solid API and a lot of integrations and partners there because you're going to need it because things are going to change. And yeah, that's it.
You know what? You've smashed that, so well done. And Fausto, final words, please.
Yeah, I agree with what Josh mentioned. So I will focus a little bit on something that Mark also repeated: go hyperlocal. Like you need to go hyperlocal. If you don't go hyperlocal, the data is not as useful. Then forget a little bit the brand. Like I don't think people in the service apartment, short-term rentals, all of that, brands are not as important. People still say that they stayed in an Airbnb and these kind of things. So use criteria. Like your comp sets should be based on criteria. This is my criteria, and if they fulfill this criteria, they are a competitor, right? And you decide the criteria. No one is telling you the criteria, but it's based on criteria, not the name. It's not because it's this name or this name and they are my competitors, because at the end, the majority of guests, they don't care about the brand itself, unless you have a very good loyalty program, and maybe they care. So criteria is important in terms of data. I will focus on this one to end.
Brilliant. And you know what? Bang on time. So well done to all of you. I've got some closing slides that I would like to finish up with. But I'll say a quick thank you to Fausto, Vincent, Augustine, Josh, and Mark for their time and contributions today. And we will leave this webinar open just for a couple of minutes at the end so that you can follow up on any of the links that we have popped into the chat. We're actually taking a short break over the summer. And we will be back in September with a whole new series of webinars, which you can see on your screens now. We'll be speaking to CEOs of companies. We are also going to be touching on flex rentals and co-living, and also looking at the next generation of TMCs. So the link to register for all our webinars have been popped into the chat. We would love to have you there. And if you're interested in working with us across our digital or in-person events, do get in touch with my colleague Katie. Her details are on your screen and also in the chat. So once again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you for tuning in. Huge thank you to PriceLabs for helping to pull together such brilliant content. I'm looking forward to our break over the summer, so look forward to seeing you all in September. And take care for now. And enjoy your summer, folks. Bye-bye.